When I first moved to Lake Ranch, I thought I had found a place untouched by the chaos of modern development. The property stretched out in rolling acres of golden grass, dotted with clusters of oak and pine, all leading down to the calm expanse of the lake. The water glistened in the sunlight, reflecting skies that seemed impossibly wide and free. Neighbors were few, bam. And that was part of the charm. Our community thrived on the understanding that what drew us here was not expansion, but preservation. The Homeowners Association, at least in theory, was meant to safeguard that way of life. They were supposed to maintain the roads, enforce basic guidelines, and protect the land and water from reckless use. That was what we paid dues for. That was the promise. But over time, I began to notice a shift in how the HOA operated. Meetings became harder to attend, often scheduled at inconvenient hours or announced with only a day's notice. Financial statements were vague, with expenditures lumped into categories so broad they raised more questions than they answered. When I and others pressed for details, the board brushed us off with excuses about confidentiality and ongoing negotiations. For a while, I assumed it was nothing more than poor organization or mismanagement. But I should have seen the warning signs sooner. Something deeper, something far more deliberate was at play. The revelation came one late afternoon when a neighbor mentioned seeing surveyors marking trees along the far side of the lake. Curious, I drove out to see for myself. There, where untouched woods once stood, bright orange ribbons flapped in the wind, tied to branches every few feet. Spray-painted stakes pierced the ground, mapping out lines as if someone were already carving the land into lots. First I thought it was a mistake, maybe utility work, or perhaps a private owner clearing boundaries. But the scope was too large. Entire stretches of shoreline were being sectioned off, and it was clear that this wasn't preparation for maintenance, it was groundwork for development. Alarmed, I dug into county records. That's when the truth surfaced. The HOA had signed over 2,500 acres, nearly half of the community's open land, to a private developer. The deal had been recorded quietly, buried in legal filings, without so much as an email to inform residents. There had been no vote, no community forum, not even a mention in the newsletters. According to the HOA, the land was underutilized, and selling it would improve property values while funding long-term infrastructure. But looking at the contract, it was clear what had really happened. They had sold our land for pennies on the dollar. Rushing the deal through with little oversight, the more I read, the worse it became. The signatures on the approval documents raised questions. Several belonged to board members who had resigned months before the sale. Some documents were notarized on dates that didn't even align with meeting records. It looked less like an oversight and more like deliberate manipulation. My stomach turned as I realized the extent of the betrayal. These weren't just administrative errors. This was fraud. The people entrusted to protect our homes had become the very ones undermining them. Soon enough, the evidence of their scheme became impossible to ignore. Heavy machinery rumbled down the newly cut paths, bulldozers tearing through meadows where cattle once grazed. Construction trailers sprouted like weeds at the edge of the forest, their presence an ugly reminder that the land was slipping away. Wildlife scattered: deer, coyotes, even the eagles that had nested by the lake. Every morning, the sound of chainsaws cut through the stillness that once defined the ranch. It was like watching a piece of paradise die by 1,000 cuts. And what stung most was knowing it had been handed over willingly by those meant to defend it. In that moment, my view of the HOA shifted completely. They weren't just incompetent bureaucrats fumbling with responsibilities. They were conspirators, willing to sacrifice the very essence of Lake Ranch for profit and power. What they had done was not merely a breach of trust, it was an attack on our way of life, one that struck at the heart of why we had all chosen this place to call home. And as I stood by the scarred earth, staring at the outlines of roads that never should have existed, I knew I couldn't let their betrayal go unanswered. The shock of discovering the HOA's betrayal quickly turned into resolve. I knew that standing idle would only ensure that developers tightened their grip on Lake Ranch, leaving nothing but scars of concrete and steel where wilderness once thrived. At first, I felt overwhelmed. What could one landowner do against a homeowners association backed by lawyers, developers, and deep pockets? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence would make me complicit. If I didn't fight for the land, no one else would. And if I fought and failed, at least I would know I tried to defend what was ours. I began with research. I spent evenings poring over county property records, HOA bylaws, and state statutes. It was slow. Frustrating work filled with legal jargon designed to discourage the average person from even trying. But persistence paid off. Buried in the HOA's own governing documents was a clause that required any land sale exceeding 50 acres to be approved by a supermajority of property owners, not just the board. The fact that 2,500 acres had been sold without so much as a community vote was more than suspicious. It was a violation of the very rules the HOA was bound to uphold. That discovery was my first weapon, and I knew I could use it. Still, legal arguments alone weren't enough. I needed allies. So I started knocking on doors and calling neighbors. Many were initially skeptical. They had heard the HOA's line that the development would bring progress and improve property values. But when I showed them the contract, when they saw with their own eyes that the land had been sold off for a fraction of its worth, their skepticism turned to outrage. Families who had lived there for generations, who had raised children by the lake and depended on the land for ranching, realized they stood to lose everything. Slowly, momentum began to build. What had started as a one-person mission became a collective cause. Together, we organized. We drafted petitions, held community meetings, and shared updates through flyers and online groups. For the first time in years, the HOA faced real opposition. The board members who once operated in secrecy now had to confront a chorus of voices, demanding answers. And though they tried to intimidate us with threats of fines and lawsuits, we stood firm. Every attempt they made to silence us only revealed how desperate they were to protect their scheme. The real turning point came when I filed for an injunction in county court, armed with the documents I had uncovered, the missing signatures, the forged approvals, the violation of the bylaws. I argued that the sale was unlawful. To my surprise, the judge didn't dismiss the case. Instead, he ordered a temporary halt to construction until the matter could be reviewed. Watching the bulldozers sit idle, engines cold, was a small but powerful victory. For the first time since this ordeal began, it felt like the tide was turning. As the legal battle unfolded, the community's pressure mounted. The petition to recall the HOA board gathered more signatures than anyone expected. We voted nearly the entire board out of office. New leadership stepped in, committed to undoing the damage and restoring trust. When the court finally ruled, it validated everything we had fought for. The sale was void due to fraud and procedural violations. The developers were forced to withdraw, and the land was returned to community ownership. Standing by the lake on the day the ruling came down, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. The fight had consumed months of my life, but it had also awakened something in me, a recognition that power only shifts when people are willing to stand up and claim it. The HOA's betrayal had been devastating, but in the end, it united us. We learned that preserving Lake Ranch required vigilance, not blind trust. That community strength was far greater than the greed of a few individuals. Looking out across the water, I saw the land not as a battlefield, but as a promised one we had fought to keep. The lake, the fields, the wildlife, all of it remained intact. Safe for now because ordinary people refused to surrender. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, about protecting something bigger than ourselves. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the acres we had reclaimed, I knew one truth would always remain. Lake Ranch belonged to those who loved it, not those who tried to exploit it.